Is Anderson Cooper merely incompetent? Or is he CNN's resident evil? Cooper claims he spent 9 months conducting an investigation for a story on Scientology. But that word, investigation, is just a pat cliche to make him sound like a legitimate journalist. In actual fact, he spent those 9 months avoiding any information, refusing to meet, refusing to conduct interviews, refusing to read sworn affidavits, even refusing open access with his video cameras to the subject of his investigation. So no, it's not a surprise that Cooper's 5-part expose was so blatantly biased, every supermarket tabloid was envious of Cooper for taking journalistic ethics to an all-time low. Among other sensationalistic sound bites he handpicked from his Kingpin Rathbone interview and then broadcast with a straight face was this one.
He treats his subordinates like slaves in a slave camp.
Slave camp? Of course, Cooper never showed it. He didn't even want to see it. That way viewers would be left to imagine for themselves, a typical tabloid trick. But let's take a look at what CNN allowed to be characterized as a slave camp. It's 500 acres in Southern California and has elsewhere been described as a state-of-the-art audio-visual production facility. So Cooper must have been referring to the working conditions. Although, does this fit the definition of slave camp? Or maybe he was referring to the film studio, one of the largest sound stages in the world? Only problem is we couldn't find any slave camp in history that had its own castle. But Anderson Cooper broadcasted, so we better look inside. It looks pretty nice. And maybe that's why it's even open for public tours. And here's the soundstage itself. If this is a slave camp, then why is it light years more comfortable and elaborate than Cooper's own studio at CNN? So obviously they must have been talking about the film and video editing facilities, with a dozen high-definition editing bays. Nope. Then it must have been the certified slave camp sound mixing facilities. Except, who wouldn't want to work in this room? Okay. Then it must be the music recording and mixing facilities that are slave camp in nature. But what about this green room? Perfect for a slave, wouldn't you say? Or possibly it's the music composition rooms that are cause for complaint, especially since all the equipment is state-of-the-art? And while we're at it, we better look at the music mix room. Is this what you'd call a slave camp? No. It must be the administration offices. After all, Cooper's source did refer to management. Here's the reception. Here's the conference room. And here's the central courtyard. If this is a management slave camp, how do you explain that CNN corporate offices are an outright embarrassment by comparison? So maybe it wasn't the offices themselves that make it a slave camp. Maybe it was the park just outside for summer picnics. Maybe that's what classifies as a camp drudgery for slaves. But wait a second. These are just the working facilities, and even though Cooper refused to look, he must be right. After all, CNN calls itself the most trusted name in news. So we better look at the staff living quarters. Here are the staff apartments. Possibly it's one of the multiple 2-story lounges and libraries that make it a 5-star, fully appointed slave camp. Or is it the apartments themselves? No, it must be their housekeeping facilities. But that would mean a central laundry that does the staff's washing, dry cleaning, and even irons their bed linen is what makes it a slave camp. Since nothing so far seems to qualify as a slave camp, then it must be that it's all work and sleep, but no recreation. But then how do you explain this communal pool and barbecue facility? Or the tennis courts? Or the basketball courts? Or the sand volleyball courts? The baseball diamond? The soccer field? Oh, here it is! The property's own golf course where the slaves are forced to swing 9-irons and brutally heavy putters. In fact, the alleged slave camp has to be everything you've just seen, because that's the property Anderson's star witness was referring to. By the way, Rathbone used to live at the facility, as you see here. And here's where he lives after he was removed from the church. Wonder now why he's bitter? Well, one might even be able to excuse Kingpin Rathbone for calling the church's workers' paradise a slave camp. After all, he is a psychotic, and psychotics are delusional, as everybody knows. But Cooper? No. He's just plain vicious and dishonest, because how else can one explain his attempted hatchet job? He was offered an opportunity to look for himself on 10 occasions. In fact, so was his producer David Doss, and his junior producer Ismail Estrada. In fact, Richard Griffiths, editorial director of CNN, was also offered open access on 16 occasions. So too Richard Davis, vice president of the so-called standards and practices of CNN, and even CNN general counsel David Vigilante. All were offered open access. All refused. So, there's only one way to explain the fiction presented by Anderson Cooper. He didn't want the truth to get in the way of his tabloid agenda.